What if the crucifixion of Jesus wasn't just a historical execution, but the single most reality-altering event in the history of the cosmos? We often think of the cross in terms of suffering blood and sacrifice, a brutal end to a holy man's life. But what if we've been missing something far deeper? What if that moment when Jesus breathed his last breath was not just the death of a man, but the cracking open of a dimension? What if the earth didn't just shake physically, but spiritually, metaphysically, cosmically? This story isn't about religion. It's about power. Hidden power. Power that terrified the religious elite and confounded the Roman Empire. Power that reached beyond time, tore the veil between dimensions, and awakened something in humanity that had long been dormant. The Gospel of Matthew records that the earth quaked, the rocks split, and the tombs of the dead broke open. These aren't just poetic flourishes. Ancient writers weren't careless with such details. They were encoding something that goes far beyond theological dogma. Something that still trembles beneath the surface of our souls. In this video, we're going to peel back the layers. We'll walk through the historical record, yes, but more importantly, we'll uncover the mystical and symbolic truths encoded within that moment on the cross, the moment when heaven collided with earth, when the temple curtain tore in two, when the Roman centurion's heart cracked open, and when the spiritual axis of the world violently shifted. You may think you know what happened on the cross, but by the end of this video, you'll realize the real story has only just begun. To truly understand the spiritual magnitude of the crucifixion, we first need to ground ourselves in the historical moment, what was actually recorded and what wasn't. Each of the four Gospels gives us a slightly different perspective on the crucifixion. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, though unified in theme, highlight different details, emotions, and symbols. But one thing remains clear across all accounts. Something extraordinary happened the moment Jesus died. Matthew 27:45 tells us that from the 6th hour until the 9th hour, that is from noon to 3 p.m., darkness covered the land. This was not a lunar eclipse, it was Passover, and the timing makes such an eclipse astronomically impossible. What then caused this 3-hour darkness? Ancient Jewish readers would have recognized this not as coincidence, but as divine judgment, a signal that heaven itself was reacting to what was unfolding on earth. At the 9th hour, Jesus cries out, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani." My God, why have you forsaken me?" A haunting cry echoing Psalm 22, not just an expression of abandonment, but a coded signal to those who knew the scriptures. Psalm 22 describes a righteous sufferer whose hands and feet are pierced, who is surrounded by enemies, who is mocked, and whose garments are divided by casting lots. It is in essence a prophecy written centuries before, fulfilled on that very hill. Then something else happens. Matthew 27:51 says, "At that moment the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open." This is not normal. Earthquakes in the middle of executions. Veils ripping from top to bottom, something only God himself could do. Tombs opening as if the underworld was responding. Luke adds his own powerful layer. He notes that Jesus' last words were, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." A declaration not of defeat, but of trust, even in death. John, always the mystic, records Jesus' final phrase, "It is finished." But the Greek word used here is tetelestai, a term also used in commerce, meaning paid in full. In other words, something had been completed, fulfilled, sealed. What we're witnessing is not a routine Roman execution. It is a cosmic event disguised in the language of suffering. Even the Roman centurion, a man hardened by death and brutality, utters words that no Gentile should have spoken. Surely this was the Son of God. Something about that moment, the sky darkening the earth, trembling the eerie silence after the cry pierced through his armor. And it should pierce ours too. When we hear that the earth shook at the moment of Jesus' death, it's easy to dismiss it as poetic metaphor, a dramatic flourish added to heighten the story's emotional weight. But in the ancient world, earthquakes weren't just geological, they were theological. In Matthew 27:51, the author is crystal clear: the earth shook, the rocks split. This wasn't just environmental chaos, it was a divine signature. In Jewish scripture, earthquakes often accompany theophanies, appearances of God. At Mount Sinai, when God gave the law to Moses, the mountain trembled violently. In the book of Isaiah, the foundations of the temple shook when Isaiah encountered God's glory. When the ground moves, heaven is speaking. So what was God saying at the cross? This was not a message of wrath. It was the end of an era. The shaking of the earth symbolized the collapse of one spiritual order and the violent birth of another. The law, the temple system, the sacrificial rituals, all of it was coming to an end. The earth didn't shake out of rage, it shook out of release. The word used in Greek for earthquake is seismos, the same root used for seismic activity, but also for upheaval and unrest. The earth was literally responding to a metaphysical shockwave. Just as our bodies tremble when something traumatic happens, the planet trembled at the trauma and triumph of the crucifixion. But there's something even more provocative here. The splitting of rocks echoes Exodus 17, when Moses struck the rock and water symbolic of life poured out for the people. Now at Calvary, the rock himself, Jesus, is struck, and out of him flows not just water, but spirit. The shaking earth announces that something hidden is being released, broken open, poured out. Some ancient mystics believed that this earthquake was not just a surface-level phenomenon, but an opening of portals, that spiritual dimensions were tearing, revealing what had been sealed for ages. This is reinforced by what follows. In Matthew, the tombs of the dead broke open. That's not the stuff of metaphor. That's a symbolic rupture of the separation between life and death, a foretaste of resurrection. And if the earth responded to Jesus' death, then we must ask, why don't we? Why is it that the planet, in all its raw sensitivity, could recognize what religion often fails? To that something irreversible had taken place. Something that would never allow the world to go back to how it was. Maybe the deeper meaning is this. When truth is crucified, the very foundations of existence are shaken. When love dies for the world can't help but tremble. And when eternity bleeds into time, nothing, not even stone, can remain unbroken. One of the most shocking details in the crucifixion account is something many readers gloss over: the tearing of the temple veil. Matthew 27:51 reports that the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, not by human hands, not gradually, but suddenly, violently from above. To grasp the magnitude of this, we need to understand what that curtain meant. In the Jewish temple, The veil separated the holy place from the most holy place, the inner sanctum, where the presence of God, the Shekinah glory, was believed to dwell. Only the high priest could enter, and only once a year on Yom Kippur, to offer blood for the atonement of sins. The veil was not just a piece of fabric, it was a cosmic boundary, a divine firewall. To pass through it uninvited was to invite death. And then in the moment Jesus dies, that centuries-old barrier is ripped open, from top to bottom, as if heaven itself had reached down and undone the separation. This wasn't just symbolic, it was scandalous. It meant that the entire temple system with its hierarchy, priesthood, sacrifices, and rituals had been rendered obsolete. Not destroyed by an enemy, but fulfilled from within. Jesus didn't just challenge the religious system, he replaced its access point entirely. No more sacred middlemen, no more layers of distance. The path was now open. This also reframes the crucifixion not as an end, but as a beginning. In dying, Jesus didn't close a chapter, he tore open a portal. His death wasn't just for forgiveness, it was for access. The veil wasn't torn to make God more visible. It was torn to show that God had always been within reach. But there's more. Jewish tradition holds that the veil was 60 feet high, 30 feet wide, and 4 inches thick. It wasn't the kind of thing you could tear by accident. According to the Talmud, it took 300 priests just to move it, for it to split instantly violently, and from top to bottom defied natural causes. This was divine interference, and let's not forget the timing. The tearing happened at the very hour of the afternoon temple sacrifice, a moment when priests would be preparing offerings behind that very veil. Can you imagine the terror? The sound of splitting cloth reverberating through the stone halls, the sudden exposure of the Holy of Holies, as if God had escaped the box religion had built for him. What the priests saw that day changed everything. Or, at least it should have. But systems resist collapse. Power structures hate surrender. Even when the veil is torn, many will try to stitch it back together, to restore control, to rebuild separation. That's what religion does when the presence moves without permission. The question then isn't whether the veil was torn. The question is whether we're still pretending it's intact. Are we still living as if we need someone else to grant us permission to access the divine? Or are we ready to walk boldly into the presence that has always waited behind the curtain and now flows freely into the open? Because the veil didn't just tear in a temple, it tore in the heart of reality. At first glance, the crucifixion looks like defeat. A man betrayed, abandoned, humiliated, nailed to a cross like a criminal. To the Romans, it was just another execution. To the Jewish leaders, it was the silencing of a threat. But to the early Christians, and to those with eyes to see this moment, was the cosmic reversal of death itself. Paul writes in Colossians 2:15 that Jesus disarmed the powers and authorities, making a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. That's a strange statement. How does someone triumph through being tortured and executed? Because the victory wasn't material, it was metaphysical. The cross was never a symbol of shame to the early believers. It became a symbol of inversion, where everything hell had planned was turned inside out. The very instrument of death became the key to life. The very site of despair became the birthplace of resurrection. In short, Jesus didn't just endure death, he entered it, cracked it open from the inside, and rewrote the rules. The ancient church held a powerful belief that after his death, Jesus descended into Sheol, the realm of the dead, not as a prisoner, but as a liberator. This tradition is known as the harrowing of hell. It imagines Christ storming the gates of death, grabbing Adam and Eve by the hand, and pulling humanity out of the grip of darkness. This wasn't just about one man dying, it was about death itself dying. In 1 Corinthians 15:26, Paul says, "The last enemy to be destroyed is death." That destruction began on the cross, and consider this, the crucifixion took place outside the city walls on a hill called Golgotha, the place of the skull. This wasn't a random location. In mystical tradition, it symbolized the human mind, the battleground between truth and illusion. So when Jesus was crucified on the skull, he wasn't just dying in the body. He was planting divine truth in the very seat of human consciousness. He was entering our broken perception of reality and resetting it from within. From this perspective, the cry, "It is finished," becomes far more than an end-of-life statement. It's a proclamation the cycle is broken, the trap is shattered, the curse is undone. The cross was not a passive surrender. It was an offensive strike against a system of spiritual bondage, a declaration of divine authority over death, deception, and fear. But here's the paradox: to win that war, Jesus had to lose, or at least appear to. And this is the pattern we're invited into. Not just to admire the cross, but to embody it. To understand that real transformation doesn't come through avoiding pain, but walking through it. That resurrection power only flows after a personal Golgotha. The world teaches us to fear death, not just physical death, but ego, death, control, death, certainty, death. But Jesus showed us that on the other side of every death is a doorway. And that doorway, once opened, cannot be closed. So yes, it looked like the end. But that was just the disguise. The truth is, death was ambushed, and the grave was never the same again. The cross is often treated as a static image, two wooden beams intersecting in violence and tragedy. But to early mystics, apostles, and church fathers, it was never just an execution device. It was a living symbol, bursting with layers of sacred meaning. The cross was not just an instrument of death, it was a tree, a ladder, and a throne. Let's begin with the tree. In Genesis, humanity falls by reaching for the fruit of the tree of knowledge, seeking wisdom apart from the divine. That act introduces death into the world. But at Calvary, another tree stands. Peter in Acts 5:30 says, "The God of our fathers raised Jesus, whom you killed by hanging him on a tree." This is not just poetic, it's theological. The cross becomes the tree of life, the inverse of Eden's mistake. In Eden, man takes from the tree and dies. On Golgotha, God gives himself on the tree, and life is restored. Next, the ladder. The book of Genesis also gives us Jacob's dream, a ladder stretching from earth to heaven, with angels ascending and descending upon it. Jesus references this in John 1:51, implying he is the ladder. The cross becomes the axis mundi, the center point connecting heaven and earth. It is not just vertical in structure, but vertical in spiritual meaning. Through the cross, the veil between dimensions is pierced. Heaven is no longer distant. The divine realm touches the dust, and then the throne. John's gospel is saturated with royal language. Jesus is robed in purple. A crown, albeit of thorns, is placed on his head. The inscription above him reads, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." But here's the deeper irony: this mockery of kingship is actually true kingship. The cross becomes Christ's enthronement. His reign begins not in power, but in surrender. Not from a golden seat, but from a wooden scaffold. This reverses everything. Earthly rulers ascend thrones to wield power over others. Jesus ascends the cross to pour himself out. The cross is not a fall from glory, it is glory revealed in its truest form. In early Christian art, you'll often find the cross depicted not as barren, but blooming, sprouting leaves, flowers, even birds. Why? Because they saw it as a cosmic tree planted in the soil of death, but rising into the heavens. A portal, a symbol of rebirth. Even the shape of the cross holds meaning: the intersection of two axes, horizontal and vertical, human and divine, temporal and eternal. At the center stands the crucified one, the bridge between opposites, the reconciliation of heaven and earth, spirit and flesh, God and man. The mystics weren't being overly symbolic. They were decoding what religion had reduced to ritual. The cross wasn't meant to be a lifeless icon. It was and still is an active blueprint of transformation, and perhaps this is why it still calls to us today. Not because of its gore, but because of its geometry. Because something in our soul recognizes it, not just as a historical event, but as a map, a tree to return to, a ladder to climb, a throne to kneel before, a symbol that invites us to see death differently and to live accordingly. For all the theological weight and cosmic symbolism, let's not forget, the crucifixion was also witnessed by human eyes. Real people stood beneath that darkened sky, watched the nails driven in, heard the last breath escape from Jesus' lips. And what they felt in that moment, the raw, immediate shock, tells us something the text alone cannot. Start with the Roman centurion. This man was no stranger to death. He had overseen executions before. Crucifixion was routine for the empire, a tool of terror, humiliation, control. But something about this death was different. Matthew 27:54 records that when he saw the earthquake and all that happened, he exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." Pause and consider that. A pagan soldier trained to obey Caesar, raised to worship the empire, suddenly recognizes divinity in the face of a dying Jew. That's not logic. That's spiritual eruption. That's a heart pierced by something no sword could replicate. Then there's Mary, his mother, standing at the foot of the cross. Imagine the agony, not just the grief of losing a son, but the deeper horror of watching him treated like a criminal while knowing he carried the promise of heaven. Her silence speaks louder than any scream. She witnessed not just death, but prophecy fulfilled in flesh and blood. John, the beloved disciple, stood beside her. Unlike the others who fled, he remained. What did he see that day? Perhaps more than anyone else, John would later reflect on this moment in mystical terms, writing in his gospel, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us." He had witnessed the unthinkable, the death of the Word, the extinguishing of light. And yet he believed that something eternal had begun. And then there were the crowds, some mocking, Some weeping, some simply stunned. Many had shouted Hosanna just days before. Now they cried, "Crucify him." But when the sky darkened and the ground shook, even the most hardened among them must have felt the chill of something beyond comprehension. Even the temple priests, the ones who orchestrated the trial, were not immune. Imagine hearing the reports. The veil torn the tombs, disturbed the centurion's confession. Something they had tried to contain had broken free. These witnesses remind us of something crucial. The cross wasn't just a metaphysical event or a theological construct. It was an emotional earthquake, a moment that cracked not just the rocks, but human hearts. A moment that demanded response, and that same invitation extends to us. We too are witnesses, though separated by time. The question isn't whether we would have stood at the foot of the cross. The question is, do we stand there now in recognition, in awe, in transformation? Because the real shockwave of Calvary didn't end that day. It continues in those who let it hit them fully, body, mind, and soul, as we step back from the hill of Golgotha and the trembling earth. It's easy to think of the cross as an event locked in history, a moment frozen in time. But the truth is far more radical. The cross was never meant to be a closed chapter. It is an ongoing invitation, a spiritual rupture that still shakes the foundations of reality and calls each of us into transformation. When the earth shook and the veil tore, it wasn't just for those standing in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. It was for all who would come after. For you. For me. What really happened on the cross was the breaking down of barriers between God and humanity, between life and death, between despair and hope. It was the moment when the axis of existence shifted, revealing that love is stronger than hate, light stronger than darkness, life stronger than death. But it's not just a story to admire from afar. It's a call to embody, to live as if the veil has been torn in your own heart, to live as if the earth beneath your feet is always ready to shake when you confront truth. To carry the paradox of the cross, that surrender is power, weakness is strength, death leads to life. So what does that mean for you today? It means you don't have to wait for some distant redemption. You are invited into it now, to walk through your own crucibles, to meet your own shadows, to open your own veil. Because the moment the earth shook was never just a moment on a hill. It was the birth of a new reality, one where God meets us in our brokenness and invites us to rise. The cross stands not as a symbol of defeat, but as a beacon of transformation. And the question remains, are you ready to feel the ground tremble beneath your own feet? Because the earth didn't just shake then. It's still shaking in those who truly see. Thank you for joining this journey. If this message resonated, consider subscribing and sharing, because the story is far from over.